The PC-011 Dynamic XL is the bigger and better version of the PC-011 Dynamic, a collaboration between Der Bauer and Lee. This case was designed from the ground up as a liquid cooling case, which means it actually has quite a few interesting quirks about it. So today, we're going to take a look at this $200 case that added RGB and extra room. Let's see if it's actually worth it. Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be embarking on what is essentially our first real case review for this channel. This case right here is actually my personal case for Supernova, my high-end editing workstation PC that is also completely liquid cooled. So I've got a lot to say about it, and let's hope we can actually get this into a reasonable amount of time. And I have a lot to tell you guys about liquid cooling in a case that was actually designed for it. The PC-011 Dynamic XL has a feature set that honestly is impressive. The entire case is made up of extremely sturdy materials with a centralized frame that relies on no structure whatsoever from the side panels. This is important because if a fully assembled system is actually put in there, you don't have to worry about the frame warping or distorting without the panels attached. In fact, the frame is so sturdy that the side panels do nothing. They in fact rattle a little bit when moving the case, and it's kind of offsetting at first. That is, until you realize that the reason they do this is to actually make the mounting system for them extremely simple. There are just little knobs at the top that slot into the top of the case and little tabs at the bottom that slot into the bottom. The entire thing comes together really simply and apart really simply. Getting into this case is super easy. You just simply remove a couple thumb screws, pull a little lever on the back, and remove the top panel, and you are good to go. Inside, there are 3 dust filters, one on the top, which you can remove easily as it's magnetic, one on the side of the case and the optional intake or exhaust area, and one on the bottom, which this one is actually held in by a rail system. Everything is toolless to get into this case, and it is greatly appreciated. That being said, the cable management bar unfortunately is not completely toolless, as it has 2 screws that hold the entire thing together. That being said, you don't necessarily have to use them, and you can completely remove them if you would like. You can fit a absolutely massive power supply in here if you so choose. And you have so much room for cable management that you really don't have to try all that hard, so put whatever you want in there. You then also have an additional 2 different 2-slot hot swap bays that are actually hooked up by default for you. You can rearrange these bays or the power supply if something doesn't quite fit right, if you so choose. You also have room for pretty much every size of motherboard, including the extremely rare Maximus Extreme sized motherboards that are really not used all that often. You essentially have true EATX if you need it. For radiator support, you can fit a 360 on the top, 360 on the bottom, and a 420 on the side, along with a 120 on the rear. You have space to do the thickest radiators possible in all of these spots if you want, but the optimal setup would probably be a medium-sized radiator in push-pull, as this would actually create the least impedance on the motherboard. That being said, everything is offset in a way that you could easily run the thickest radiators you want and still probably not run into any issues, especially with your cooling. There is an optional distribution plate that you can purchase to place in the spot of the 480mm radiator, and we opted in on that as we thought it looked quite nice. Going back to the case though, it does have 4 USB 3.0 ports, a USB-C port, an RGB controller, RGB of course, a mic headphone jack, and power reset button. Wow. Go figure, it has a power reset button. That being said, this thing is a feature-rich case. It is completely sturdy, and it is fairly unique to build in. You can build just about any build you want in it. If you really want to do an air-cooled system, you can do a very positive pressure system by using the side panel as intake, or the bottom panel and doing a chimney style, and completely locking everything up. You have drive support on the cosmetic panels that allow you to put an extra 4 drives, so if you want to make some sort of a file server in here, you absolutely could. Not to mention, you could easily cool a Threadripper or even a Intel high-end motherboard in this with no problems whatsoever. If you want to max out your rads and just use a reservoir attached to the rad, you can do it. If you want to do a dual loop with 2 360s, that's completely okay. We went with what could easily be considered the default mode for this case. We had the distribution plate along with 2 360 radiators. And we went with the extra thick version and an extra thin version because we weren't quite sure how much space we would actually have. In retrospect, I would actually do a medium-sized rad in push-pull, as that would actually end up probably performing better than the version I've got now. Luckily though, the bottom of the case has plenty of room for intake, and the case does remain extremely cool in its configuration. But it is not necessarily the quietest case. And that is because, well, there's no structure here. There's nothing really holding these glass panels down. They wobble ever so slightly. It's not much, and it's not like it's something that's going to be obnoxious. But the case itself is not really sealed. It's not done in a way that will prevent you from hearing the sound. The big saving grace to this is the fact that it's completely liquid cooled, and the fans rarely, if ever, have to ramp up all that much. So that's the case. How is it to build in though? Building in this case was actually very interesting. You see, normally I would think that something completely designed for liquid cooling would be easier than the other cases that I have built in. That is not necessarily the case here. Getting your components in there is actually a breeze. This wide open area means that you can pretty much do anything in any order you so choose. Of course, we did put our water block on our motherboard and throw our RAM in there because why not? And getting it onto the standoffs, I could easily swap out RAM if I needed to from a standing position. Not to mention, the spacing in the back allows you to actually access your motherboard tray pretty easily, and if you had to swap out your cooler on the fly while standing, you could. There's plenty of room for a power supply, and it honestly just works. Sliding hard drives into a hot slot bay is like the easiest thing possible, and getting radiators into these massive spaces with fans on them was super easy. In fact, actually, the bottom space actually comes out with its own bracket that you can then attach. Because the top panel actually completely slots off, getting a rad up there was no problem whatsoever. And getting the distribution plate hooked in there, again, was super simple, as we had full access to that area. Getting everything cable managed and wired up, again, was easy. We had a hot swap plate, so all we had to do was make sure that was powered. We had to get our motherboard completely plugged up, and again, super simple since there was so much room. Cable management is a little weird in this case though, because it's not really what you would traditionally expect from a case. Because the cables essentially have one massive channel for themselves, you spend most of your time kind of bundling light cables together and then just kind of tying them down a little bit. There aren't that many cable tie points, but it's not really all that necessary. That did mean that we did decide to not use the SSD mounts on the back of the cable management bar. The way we have it actually set up, I decided to just leave the cable management bar toolless, as it made it a little bit easier for us to access things like RGB and fans when they weren't quite working properly. Essentially, getting everything hooked up is super simple, and getting it all tied down is even simpler. So then where's our problem? Well, it comes with the distribution plate. You see, the distribution plate isn't really set up in a way that everything can line up perfectly the first time. In fact, the first time we ran this case, this loop did not look very good. We chose to line the GPU up as that was the more important and the start of the loop. But the CPU did not look all that great, as it had to come at a pretty extreme angle. We later revised this in a way that has the CPU doing 290s in it, which is not necessarily ideal, but in this case is pretty much the only way to run it and make it look clean. If you were to run something in Crossfire or SLI, I'm sure that loop would also be quite a bit difficult to get the spacing going. Essentially, the entire case came together. It was a bit more difficult than you would expect when there's pretty much dedicated ports for everything. That being said, it wasn't our only issue with the case and in the build. This case has two internal USB 3.0 headers and an internal USB-C header. Now, in hindsight, I should have saw this as a problem, but I did not at first. Most motherboards don't have all of those connectors on them. They'll usually have either two USB 3.0 or one USB-C and one USB 3.0. My motherboard has one USB-C and one USB 3.0. Therefore, I had to adapt out one of my USB 3.0s to USB 2.0, which meant I had to get an adapter. Not to mention, the way that my motherboard is placed, that USB 3.0 port actually does interfere with the extra thick radiator. Meaning, I had to get a 90-degree angle adapter to make sure my USB 3.0 ports could get plugged in. Front panel headers, of course, are super simple, but unfortunately, the angle in which the USB 3.0 makes me believe that really Lee & Lee should have invested in doing 90-degree ports instead of doing the straight ones that they did. Once we got everything hooked up and powered on though, we ran into another little snag, and that was air in the loop. This loop is hard to drain, and it's because of the distribution plate. The loop essentially pushes itself up first. It goes through the GPU, back in to the CPU, back in, into the first rad, and then down to the second rad and back to the pump. The problem is the part of the loop where it goes down, essentially two stages, is actually very hard to bleed. Air naturally wants to float to the top. Now, if you had a radiator that had a second opening, you might be thinking, oh, I'll just open up that and that should bleed it just fine. Problem is, unfortunately, the space in where that hole would be is completely blocked off. In a revision of this case, I would actually like to see Lee & Lee leave a space there for that purpose, as everything else has a place. There is a dedicated fill port on the back of the distribution plate. There's a dedicated drain port on the back of the distribution plate. But there really isn't a way to bleed the top all that easily. Essentially, once we got it all together and rebuilt it 3 different times and getting the air out of it 3 different times, we also found one other flaw. Due to the size and runs that this case requires, we actually had fittings come loose a couple times. Mainly because we had to hold the case upside down in order to actually bleed the loop. Now, EK cryofuel did come in handy here, as it made it so that my PC did not die when it got completely soaked. And luckily, cryofuel does kind of dry completely in like a couple minutes. So it wasn't too nerve-wracking, if not heartbreaking. But I have killed components using it before, so it was a bit of a scary experience. That being said, EK Torx fittings will probably actually solve this problem. We also did use a lot more fittings than would be expected in this kind of build because the tubing length necessary to do this is kind of extreme. If we were to actually do our bends and possibly mess them up, I would have had to pay a lot more for tubing than I did. And wasted plastic is still wasted plastic. So the way that we did things, I ended up liking, but it still runs a lot of risk due to the fact that every fitting is a potential point of failure. All in all, this was still difficult, but high-end liquid cooling is difficult. This case only made it slightly less inconvenient. I didn't have to plan out my loop. My loop was planned out for me essentially by Lee & Lee and EK. The loop goes one way and it goes together one way, and it actually makes it much easier for me and making it so that I pretty much know exactly how things have to go. If I had any suggestion for this aspect, is I would actually recommend EK release the tubing lengths that would be necessary for most computers. That way you can kind of follow along with that, or even sell pre-cut tubing for it. I think at Micro Centers you can get the pre-cut tubing for the 011 dynamic. So essentially, like, this could be easier, but the results speak for themselves. This PC is beautiful. It is a work of art. This is easily the nicest computer I've ever built, and it is the most beautiful computer I've ever built. I personally love how it came out, and I love everything about it. And I will probably continue to use this case, even despite its downsides. I actually love how the whole thing came together. And I know that sometime down the line when the pump stops working, I can go to EK and I can get a replacement. And I know Lee & Lee is going to continue to support this case for years to come, as that is what they do. Essentially, I asked the question, is it worth $200 for this? And honestly, I would say yes. Everything about this case feels premium. Everything looks premium. It is the kind of case that you never have to replace. And for $200, that is a steal. There will be new technology that will come out. Maybe USB 4 will eventually outdate it. But I think we will honestly see a revision of this case when that time comes, because it's just so good. It wouldn't make the best air-cooled system. Plain and simple. But for water cooling systems, I can't think of anything better right now. The only cases that might be able to offer more in terms of features are absolutely massive. And when it comes down to it, this thing is not the largest case I've ever even used. I used the NZXT Phantom, for God's sakes, and that thing is pretty thick. Either way, I completely love this thing. I think it's worth the money, and realistically, although it was difficult to build in, it was less difficult to build in than the other cases that I have actually done high-end liquid cooling in. Essentially, high-end liquid cooling is hard to do. And if you're going to do it, this is a great case to do it in. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this video. I honestly love this case, and I can't wait to see what crazy stuff I come up to do with it in the future. So thank you guys again. Wolfie, out.